The dust hung thick in the air of Hays City, Kansas, that afternoon in late July of 1873, and Sarah Emerson could taste the bitterness of it on her tongue as she stood in front of the general store, the letter from the bank crumpled in her trembling hand. The words on that paper might as well have been a death sentence. $300 by the end of the week, or she would lose everything her father had built before the fever took him 6 months ago. The dry goods store that had been in her family for 15 years would be auctioned off to the highest bidder, and she would be left with nothing but the clothes on her back and nowhere to go. She was 22 years old, unmarried, and completely alone in a town that didn't take kindly to women trying to run businesses on their own. The creditors had been patient at first, sympathetic even when her father passed. But sympathy didn't pay bills, and patience had its limits. Now Victor Blackthorne, the man who held the note on the store, was demanding full payment. He had made it clear during his visit that morning that he had other plans for the property, plans that didn't include a young woman struggling to keep her head above water. Sarah pressed her palm against the rough wooden post outside the store, trying to steady herself. The heat was oppressive, the kind that made your head swim and your vision blur at the edges. She had spent the last 3 days trying to figure out how to raise the money. She had sold everything of value she owned, down to her mother's wedding ring, but it had only brought in $75. She had begged the other merchants in town for loans, but they all had their own troubles, their own debts to worry about. The sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk made her look up. A man was walking toward her, tall and broad-shouldered, with the easy gait of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun, and a kerchief was tied loosely around his neck. His clothes were dusty from the trail, his leather vest worn but well-maintained. There was something about the way he moved that caught her attention, a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with the chaos she felt swirling inside her own chest. "Excuse me, miss," he said, tipping his hat as he approached. His voice was deep and warm, with a slight drawl that suggested he was from somewhere south of here. "I'm looking for a place to buy some supplies. Would this be the dry goods store?" Sarah quickly wiped her eyes, hoping he hadn't noticed the tears that had been threatening to fall. "It is," she said, forcing her voice to sound steady. "What do you need?" He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes taking in her distressed state with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Are you all right?" he asked, ignoring her question entirely. "I'm fine," she lied, straightening her shoulders. "Just the heat getting to me. Now, what can I help you find?" He didn't move, didn't look away. "You don't look fine," he said quietly. "You look like someone just told you the world was ending." Sarah felt a surge of frustration. She didn't know this man, didn't owe him any explanations. "My problems are my own," she said sharply. "If you're here to buy something, come inside. If not, I have work to do." She turned on her heel and walked into the store, letting the door swing shut behind her. The interior was blessedly cooler, though still warm enough to make sweat bead on her forehead. She moved behind the counter and began sorting through the account books, trying to appear busy, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. The door opened again, and the cowboy stepped inside. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the edges. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 26 or 27. His face was tanned from long hours in the sun, with a strong jaw and a mouth that looked like it was more accustomed to smiling than frowning. "I need coffee, beans, flour, and salt," he said, approaching the counter. "And some tobacco if you have it." Sarah nodded and began gathering the items, grateful for something to focus on besides her mounting panic. She worked in silence, measuring out the goods and wrapping them in brown paper. The cowboy watched her, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "Name's Mason Trent," he said after a moment. "I'm passing through on my way to Colorado. Got a job waiting for me at a ranch up near Denver." "Sarah Emerson," she replied automatically, tying string around one of the packages. "That will be $2.40. He pulled out his money and counted it onto the counter. As she reached for it, he caught her wrist gently. "Miss Emerson," he said, his voice low. "I don't mean to pry, but I've been on the trail long enough to recognize trouble when I see it. If there's something I can help with, I'd be willing to listen." Sarah pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. "I don't need help from strangers," she said coldly. "Thank you for your business." Mason held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "All right," he said. "I didn't mean to offend you." He gathered his supplies and headed toward the door, but paused with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth, I hope things work out for you." After he left, Sarah sank onto the stool behind the counter and let her head fall into her hands. She was being foolish, she knew. Pride wouldn't save her store. Pride wouldn't put food on her table or keep a roof over her head. But the thought of accepting help from anyone, especially a complete stranger, made her feel weak and helpless in a way she couldn't bear. The afternoon dragged on with only a handful of customers. Most people in Hays City did their shopping in the morning or evening when the heat was less oppressive. Sarah used the quiet time to go over her books again, searching for some solution she might have missed, some miracle that would save her. But the numbers didn't lie. She was short by $225, and she had no way of getting it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the door opened again. Sarah looked up, expecting a late customer, and felt her stomach drop when she saw Victor Blackthorne walk in. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with graying hair and cold blue eyes that never seemed to blink. He wore an expensive suit that was completely impractical for the Kansas heat, but he liked people to know he had money to burn. "Miss Emerson," he said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. "I trust you received my letter." "I did," Sarah said, standing up and squaring her shoulders, "but I need more time. The store has been doing better lately, and if you could just extend the loan for another few months—" "I'm afraid that's not possible," Blackthorne interrupted, pulling out a pocket watch and checking the time as if he had somewhere more important to be. "I've been more than generous with you, my dear. Your father's death was unfortunate, but business is business. I need my money by Friday or I'll have no choice but to foreclose." "Please," Sarah said, hating the desperation in her voice but unable to stop it. "This store is all I have. It's all I've ever known. Just give me one more chance." Blackthorne smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "There is one way you could make this problem go away," he said, moving closer to the counter. "I'm a widower, as you know, and I've been looking for a suitable wife. You're a pretty girl, Sarah, despite your stubbornness. Marry me, and I'll forgive the debt entirely. You can keep the store, and you'll have the security of being married to one of the wealthiest men in Hays City." Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. She had suspected this was coming, had seen the way Blackthorne looked at her during his previous visits. The thought of marrying him, of letting him touch her, made her skin crawl. "I'd rather lose everything," she said through gritted teeth. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "Then you will," he said flatly. "You have until Friday, Miss Emerson. If you don't have my money by then, the sheriff will be here to remove you from the premises. Good evening." He walked out, leaving Sarah shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. She closed the store early that night, unable to face any more customers, and climbed the stairs to the small apartment above the shop where she lived. She didn't bother lighting a lamp, just sat in the darkness and let the tears finally come. The next morning, Sarah woke with gritty eyes and a pounding headache. She forced herself to eat a piece of bread and drink some water, then opened the store at her usual time. There was no point in giving up before Friday arrived. Maybe a miracle would happen. Maybe someone would walk through that door with enough money to save her. Around mid-morning, that door did open, but it wasn't a miracle. It was Mason Trent, the cowboy from the day before. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his face freshly shaved, his clothes brushed free of trail dust. He carried his hat in his hand and looked almost nervous as he approached the counter. "Miss Emerson," he said, "I hope you don't mind me coming back." "You're a customer," Sarah said, her voice flat. "You're always welcome. What do you need today?" "I need to talk to you," he said. "Last night at the saloon, I heard some men talking. They were saying Victor Blackthorne is trying to take your store, that you owe him money you can't pay." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Of course the whole town knew. In a place like Hayes City, nothing stayed private for long. "I don't see how that's any of your concern," she said stiffly. "It's not," Mason admitted. "But I want it to be. How much do you owe him?" $300, Sarah said before she could stop herself. "But I'm not asking you for money, Mr. Trent. I don't even know you." "You don't," he agreed. "But I know what it's like to lose everything. My family had a ranch in Texas down near San Antonio. When I was 17, a drought wiped us out. We lost the land, lost the cattle, lost everything. My parents died the following winter, and I've been drifting ever since. I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the sincerity in his eyes. "I appreciate your sympathy," she said softly. "But unless you have $300 you're willing to part with, there's nothing you can do." "Actually," Mason said, reaching into his vest pocket, "I do." He pulled out a leather pouch and set it on the counter. It landed with a heavy thud, the unmistakable sound of coins. Sarah stared at it, her heart beginning to race. "What is that?" she whispered. 5 years of savings," Mason said. "Every dollar I've earned working cattle drives, breaking horses, doing odd jobs from Texas to Montana. I've been saving it to buy my own piece of land someday, to start fresh. It's $340, enough to pay off Blackthorne and have a little left over." Sarah shook her head, backing away from the counter. "I can't take your money," she said. "That's your future. That's everything you've worked for." "And this store is everything you've worked for," Mason countered. "The difference is I'm just one man. I can always earn more. But you've got something worth saving here, something your father built. I can't stand by and watch someone lose that when I have the means to help." "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this for me? You don't know me. We met yesterday." Mason was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes searching hers. "I can't explain it," he said finally. "When I saw you standing outside yesterday, looking like your whole world was falling apart, something in my chest just tightened up. I spent all night thinking about it, trying to talk myself out of it. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face. I know it doesn't make sense, but I have to do this. Please let me help you." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. No one had ever done something like this for her, not without expecting something in return. "I'll pay you back," she said firmly. "Every cent. I don't know how long it will take, but I swear I'll pay you back." "I know you will," Mason said, pushing the pouch across the counter. "But there's no rush. Take whatever time you need." Sarah picked up the pouch with trembling hands. It was heavier than she expected, solid and real. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll have dinner with me tonight," Mason said with a small smile. "I'm going to be in town for a few more days, and I'd like to get to know you better." Sarah laughed through her tears. "You just gave me your life savings and you want dinner in return. That's not exactly a fair trade." "I think it's more than fair," Mason said. "So what do you say?" "Will you have dinner with me?" "Yes," Sarah said, clutching the pouch to her chest. "Yes, I will." That afternoon, Sarah marched straight to Blackthorn's office with Mason by her side. The creditor's face went through a series of expressions when she walked in, from surprise to displeasure to barely concealed anger when she dumped the contents of the leather pouch onto his desk. $300, Sarah said, her voice steady and strong. "Count it." "That's the full amount I owe you, which means the store is mine, free and clear." Blackthorn's eyes flicked to Mason, taking in his dusty cowboy attire with obvious disdain. "And where did you get this money?" he asked Sarah. "Did you rob a bank?" "That's none of your business," Sarah said. "All you need to know is that the debt is paid. I want a receipt stating that I own the store outright, and I want it now." For a moment, Sarah thought Blackthorn might refuse. His jaw clenched and his hands balled into fists on his desk. But Mason took a step forward, and something in his posture, in the way he looked at the older man, made Blackthorn reconsider. He began counting the money with deliberate slowness, his face red with suppressed rage. When he finished, he scrawled out a receipt and shoved it across the desk. "You've made a mistake, Miss Emerson," he said coldly. "You could have had security, comfort, a real future. Instead, you've tied yourself to that pathetic little store. Let's see how long it takes before you're in debt again." "I'll take my chances," Sarah said, picking up the receipt and folding it carefully. "Good day, Mr. Blackthorn." Outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer, brighter than it had in months. Sarah turned to Mason, who was grinning at her with obvious pride. "You were magnificent in there," he said. "I thought you were going to reach across that desk and punch him." "I wanted to," Sarah admitted, "but that would have been satisfying for about 2 seconds before the sheriff arrested me." She looked down at the receipt in her hand, then back up at Mason. "I still can't believe you did this. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out it was all a dream." "It's real," Mason assured her, "and I don't regret it for a second." He offered her his arm. "Now, about that dinner. There's a restaurant down the street that smells like it serves decent food. Let me take you there." They ate at a small establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who served them roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, followed by apple pie that melted in their mouths. As they ate, they talked. Mason told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the freedom and loneliness of life on the trail. Sarah told him about her father, about learning the business from the time she was a little girl, about the fear and determination she had felt trying to keep it going after his death. "He would have been proud of you," Mason said quietly, "the way you fought to keep his legacy alive." "I almost lost it anyway," Sarah said. "If you hadn't come along, but I did," Mason interrupted. "And maybe that's not coincidence. Maybe some things are just meant to be." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "You don't strike me as the type of man who believes in fate." "I didn't used to be," Mason said, his eyes holding hers across the table. "But I'm starting to reconsider." As the days passed, Mason stayed in Hays City. He told Sarah he was in no hurry to get to Colorado, that the job could wait a few more weeks. He helped her around the store, repairing shelves that had come loose, reorganizing stock, and charming customers with his easy smile and genuine interest in their lives. Sarah found herself looking forward to his arrival each morning, found herself watching the door whenever she heard footsteps on the sidewalk. They had dinner together every evening, sometimes at Mrs. Patterson's restaurant, sometimes in the apartment above the store where Sarah would cook simple meals and they would eat by lamplight, talking late into the night. Mason told her about his dreams of owning a ranch, of breeding horses, of building something permanent instead of always moving from place to place. Sarah told him about her fears of being alone, of failing, of not being strong enough to survive in a world that didn't want to make room for women like her. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," Mason said one night as they sat on the steps outside the store, watching the stars come out. "You didn't give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. That takes courage most people don't have." "I had help," Sarah said, leaning her shoulder against his, "from a stubborn cowboy who gave me his life savings." "Best decision I ever made," Mason said softly. He turned to look at her, and Sarah felt her breath catch at the intensity in his eyes. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I came to Hayes City planning to pass through to stay maybe one night, two at most. But then I met you and everything changed. I can't stop thinking about you. I don't want to go to Colorado. I don't want to leave you." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "Then don't," she whispered. "Stay here. Stay with me." Mason cupped her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I don't have much to offer you. I gave you all my money, remember?" "I don't care about money," Sarah said, covering his hands with hers. "I care about you. These past 2 weeks have been the happiest I've been since my father died, maybe even happier than that. When I'm with you, I feel like I can do anything, be anything. I feel like I'm not alone anymore." "You're not alone," Mason said, and then he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was afraid she might pull away. But Sarah leaned into him, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair, and the kiss deepened into something that made her forget where they were, forget everything except the feeling of his mouth on hers, and the solid warmth of his body against hers. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "I know it's fast, I know it's crazy, but I love you, Sarah Emerson." "I love you too," Sarah said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I think I started falling for you the moment you walked into my store with that ridiculous offer to help." "It wasn't ridiculous," Mason protested. "It was romantic." "It was both," Sarah said, kissing him again. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the town church. Mrs. Patterson served as Sarah's witness, and Mason asked the owner of the livery stable, a grizzled old man named Tom who had befriended him during his stay, to stand up for him. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that had been her mother's, and Mason bought a new shirt and vest for the occasion. The preacher kept the ceremony short, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Mason swept Sarah into his arms and kissed her to the applause and cheers of the small gathering of townspeople who had come to watch. They moved into the apartment above the store together, combining their lives in ways that felt both strange and perfectly natural. Mason took on more responsibilities in the store, using his natural charm to attract new customers and his business sense to help Sarah expand their inventory. He also started taking odd jobs around town, breaking horses, helping with construction, anything that would bring in extra money. Sarah watched him work with a sense of wonder and gratitude that never quite faded. He had given up his dream of owning a ranch, his plans for Colorado, all of it, to stay with her. And he never complained, never seemed to regret his choice. Instead, he threw himself into their life together with an enthusiasm that was contagious. One evening, about 6 months after their wedding, Sarah was closing up the store when Mason came in carrying a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "We're celebrating," he announced, setting the items on the counter. "Celebrating what?" Sarah asked, laughing at his obvious excitement. "I've been doing some calculating," Mason said, pouring them each a drink. "Between the store's profits and what I've been making on the side, we've earned enough to pay back half of what I gave you. At this rate, we'll have the full amount back in another 6 months." Sarah took the glass he offered but set it down without drinking. "Mason," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about that, about the money." His expression became wary. "What about it?" "I don't want to give it back to you," Sarah said. I want us to use it for something else." Mason looked confused. "Like what?" "Like buying land," Sarah said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "You gave up your dream of having a ranch to stay here with me, but what if we could have both? There's a property about 5 miles outside of town, 160 acres with water access and decent grazing land. The owner died last year, and his widow wants to sell. We could buy it, Mason. We could build you that ranch you've always wanted." Mason stared at her, his glass halfway to his lips. "Sarah, that's not necessary. I'm happy here, happy with you and the store." "I know you are," Sarah said, "but I also know you look at the horses in the livery stable with longing in your eyes. I know you miss being out on the land, working with animals, having space to breathe. I love you, Mason, and I want you to have your dream. We can keep the store, hire someone to help run it, and build a ranch together. We can have it all." Mason set down his glass and pulled her into his arms. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured into her hair. "How did I find someone as perfect as you?" "I ask myself that question every day," Sarah said, wrapping her arms around his waist. "So what do you say? Should we go look at that property tomorrow?" "Yes," Mason said, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "Yes, absolutely yes." They bought the land a month later, and Mason threw himself into building their ranch with the same determination he had shown in helping with the store. He designed a small house, modest but sturdy, with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that let in plenty of light. He built a barn and corrals and began buying horses, starting with breeding stock that would form the foundation of their herd. Sarah split her time between the store and the ranch, hiring a young man named Daniel to help with the day-to-day operations of the business so she could spend more time with Mason. She loved watching him work, loved seeing the joy on his face when he was training a young colt or repairing fences or simply standing in the middle of their land, surveying everything they had built together. 2 years after their marriage, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She told Mason one evening as they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the Kansas prairie. He let out a whoop of joy that probably carried all the way to Hays City, then picked her up and carried her inside, declaring that she wasn't allowed to do any heavy work from that moment on. "Mason, I'm pregnant, not dying," Sarah protested, laughing. "I can still function like a normal human being." "Not taking any chances," Mason said firmly. "You're carrying the most precious cargo in the world, our baby, our son or daughter." "You're impossible," Sarah said, but she was smiling as she said it. Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1876, a healthy baby with dark hair and his father's eyes. They named him Samuel, after Sarah's father. Mason held him with a tenderness that made Sarah's heart ache, his large, work-roughened hands cradling the tiny infant as if he was made of glass. "He's perfect," Mason whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Sarah, he's absolutely perfect." "He is," Sarah agreed, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. "He's ours." Life settled into a rhythm after Samuel's birth. The store continued to thrive and the ranch grew steadily. Mason gained a reputation for training excellent horses, and buyers came from as far as Denver and St. Louis to purchase from him. They hired help for both the store and the ranch, allowing them more time to focus on their family. 3 years after Samuel was born, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Emma. She had her mother's auburn hair and a stubborn streak that showed itself early. Mason doted on both children, teaching Samuel to ride almost as soon as he could walk and carrying Emma around the ranch on his shoulders, pointing out horses and cattle, and explaining everything in the patient, gentle way that made Sarah fall in love with him all over again. One evening, when Samuel was 7 and Emma was 4, The family gathered on the porch after dinner. Samuel was practicing his reading, sounding out words from a primer, while Emma played with a rag doll Sarah had made for her. Mason sat with his arm around Sarah, both of them watching their children with contentment. "You remember the day we met?" Sarah asked quietly. "Every detail," Mason said. "You were standing outside the store looking like your world was ending. You had dust on your dress and tears in your eyes, and you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." "I thought you were crazy," Sarah admitted. "When you offered to help, I thought you had to be either crazy or trying to trick me somehow." "I was a little crazy," Mason said with a laugh. "Falling in love with you after 5 minutes, giving you every penny I had, but I'd do it again in a heartbeat." "So would I," Sarah said, tilting her head to kiss him. "Thank you for saving me, Mason. Thank you for staying." "You saved me right back," Mason said, pulling her closer. "I was drifting before I met you, just moving from place to place with no real purpose. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to put down roots. Everything good in my life started the day I walked into that store." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out one by one. Samuel eventually tired of reading and climbed into his father's lap, while Emma abandoned her doll to curl up against her mother. Sarah looked at her family, at the ranch spreading out before them, at the life they had built together, and felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. "I love you," she whispered to Mason. "I love you too," he whispered back. "Always." The years continued to pass, bringing their share of challenges and triumphs. Droughts came and went, requiring careful management of their water resources. Winters were harsh and summers were brutal. But through it all, Sarah and Mason faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle they overcame. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful young man who inherited his grandfather's head for business. At 15, he was already helping manage the finances for both the store and the ranch, his careful records and strategic planning helping them navigate economic downturns that devastated other families. Emma, in contrast, was wild and free-spirited, more comfortable on horseback than in a dress, with a natural talent for training horses that rivaled her father's. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Mason surprised Sarah with a trip to Denver. They left the children in the care of Mrs. Patterson, who had become a beloved grandmother figure to Samuel and Emma, and took the train to Colorado. It was Sarah's first time away from Hays City in years, and she felt like a young girl again as she watched the landscape roll past the train windows. In Denver, Mason took her to a fine restaurant, then to a theater where they watched a performance of Shakespeare's As You Like It. Afterward, in their hotel room, he gave her a gift, a delicate gold locket containing tiny photographs of their children. "Mason, this is too much," Sarah protested, but her hands were shaking as she opened the locket. "It must have cost a fortune." "You're worth a fortune," Mason said, fastening it around her neck. "You're worth everything I have and more. I wanted you to have something beautiful, something that reminds you of what we've built together." Sarah turned in his arms, the locket warm against her skin. "I don't need a locket to remind me," she said. "I carry it all in my heart, every moment of every day." They made love that night with the same passion they had felt as newlyweds, reaffirming the bond that had only grown stronger over the years. In the morning, they walked through the streets of Denver hand in hand, marveling at the electric lights that were just beginning to appear in some buildings, the new technologies that were changing the world. "You ever miss it?" Sarah asked as they stood watching a demonstration of a telephone. "The adventure, the freedom of being on the trail, going wherever you wanted." Mason looked at her in surprise. "Not for a second," he said. "Sarah, before I met you, I wasn't free, I was lost. Adventure is meaningless if you have no one to share it with. I found what I was looking for the day I walked into your store, even though I didn't know I was looking for it. You, our children, our home, that's my adventure. That's my freedom. They returned to Hayes City renewed and invigorated, ready to face whatever came next, and what came next was growth. The ranch expanded to 300 acres, with a herd of horses that was known throughout Kansas and beyond. The store added a second floor, expanding into clothing and hardware in addition to the dry goods that had always been their mainstay. They built homes for their hired hands, creating a small community on the ranch property. Sarah watched it all with a sense of pride that sometimes brought tears to her eyes. She thought often of that day when she had stood outside the store, hopeless and defeated, certain that she would lose everything. She thought of the tall cowboy who had walked into her life and changed everything with his kindness and his impossible, beautiful gesture. When Samuel turned 18, they made him a full partner in the store. When Emma turned 16, they did the same with the ranch, recognizing her skill and dedication. Their children were good people, kind and hardworking, with their parents' determination and compassion. Sarah knew that whatever happened, the legacy she and Mason had built would continue. One evening in late summer, when Sarah was 45 and Mason was 49, they rode out to a hill on the edge of their property, a spot where they could see both the ranch and the distant outline of Hayes City. They had taken to doing this on special occasions, finding peace in the expansive view and the quiet companionship they shared. 22 years, Sarah said, leaning back against Mason's chest as they sat on the grass. Can you believe it's been 22 years since we met? Best 22 years of my life, Mason said, wrapping his arms around her, though you're even more beautiful now than you were then. You're a terrible liar, Sarah said, laughing. I have gray hair and wrinkles. You have wisdom and character, Mason corrected. And you're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. They watched the sun set in comfortable silence, the sky turning brilliant shades of orange and red and purple. Below them, lights began to appear in the ranch houses and in the distant town, little beacons of warmth in the gathering darkness. You ever wonder what would have happened if you had kept riding that day? Sarah asked. If you had bought your supplies and gone on to Colorado? I used to, Mason admitted. In the early days when things were hard, when we were struggling to make ends meet. But not anymore. I know exactly what would have happened. I would have gotten that job, worked for someone else's dream, probably saved up enough to buy a small piece of land somewhere. I might have even found someone to marry eventually, but it wouldn't have been this. It wouldn't have been you, our children, this life we've built. I would have survived, but I wouldn't have truly lived. I wouldn't have survived, Sarah said quietly. Without you, I would have lost the store. I probably would have ended up married to Blackthorn or someone like him, miserable and trapped. You didn't just save my business, Mason. You saved my life. Then we saved each other, Mason said, kissing the top of her head. And we built something neither of us could have built alone. As the stars began to appear, they rode back to the ranch house, where light spilled from the windows and the sound of Emma's laughter drifted out into the night. Inside, they found Samuel and Emma arguing good-naturedly about the best way to break a particularly stubborn young stallion, while their ranch foreman and his family shared a meal at the long kitchen table. This was home, Sarah thought as Mason took her hand and led her inside. This warmth, this noise, this sense of belonging and purpose. This was what they had created together, brick by brick, day by day, with love and determination and an unwavering belief in each other. In the years that followed, Sarah and Mason watched their children marry and start families of their own. Samuel married a schoolteacher from Hayes City, a smart, ambitious woman who helped him expand the store into a chain of 3 locations across Kansas. Emma married one of their ranch hands, a quiet, capable man who shared her love of horses and open spaces. They took over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, allowing Sarah and Mason to step back and enjoy their grandchildren. There were 5 grandchildren in total, 3 boys and 2 girls, and they brought a new kind of joy into Sarah and Mason's lives. Mason taught them to ride, just as he had taught their parents, and Sarah told them stories about their grandfather, the man who had built the store from nothing, and taught her that family and community were the most important things in the world. On their 30th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house was packed with people, 3 generations of Trents and Emersons and the families they had married into. There was music and dancing, enormous amounts of food and toasts that went on for hours. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone home or retired to the guest houses, Sarah and Mason slipped away to their porch. They sat in the rocking chairs they had bought years ago, holding hands and watching the moon rise over the prairie. 30 years, Mason said, shaking his head in wonder. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've always been together. I know what you mean, Sarah said. I can barely remember what life was like before you. It seems so distant, like a story that happened to someone else. Are you happy? Mason asked, turning to look at her. Truly happy. More than I ever dreamed possible, Sarah said without hesitation. You've given me everything I never knew I wanted, Mason. A partnership built on respect and trust, children who make me proud every single day, a legacy that will outlast us both. But most of all, you've given me love. Real, enduring, unconditional love. How could I be anything but happy? Good, Mason said, his voice thick with emotion. Because making you happy has been the greatest honor of my life. They sat together as the night deepened, talking about everything and nothing, reminiscing about the past and making plans for the future. They talked about taking a trip to California, about building a bigger house for Samuel's growing family, about adding more breeding stock to the ranch. They talked about their hopes for their grandchildren and their dreams of seeing the new century that was rapidly approaching. As they finally headed inside to bed, Sarah paused in the doorway and looked back at the land spreading out before them. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, was the road that had brought Mason to Hays City all those years ago. The road that had led him to her store, to her life, to this moment. Thank you, she whispered to the universe, to fate, to whatever force had brought them together. Inside, Mason was waiting for her, his hand extended. Sarah took it, feeling the familiar calluses, the warmth, the strength that had supported her through every challenge and celebrated every triumph. They climbed the stairs to their bedroom together, just as they had done thousands of times before, just as they would do thousands of times more. In the morning, they would wake early, as always. Mason would check on the horses while Sarah made breakfast. Their children and grandchildren would come by for coffee and conversation. The ranch would hum with activity, and the store in town would open its doors to another day of business. Life would go on in its beautiful, ordinary way, each day adding another thread to the tapestry they had been weaving together for 3 decades. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of their room, with Mason's arms around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Sarah thought about that desperate, frightened young woman she had been, standing outside her father's store with a letter that spelled disaster. She thought about the cowboy who had walked into her life with nothing but kindness and an impossible offer. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything, and how that near loss had led to gaining more than she had ever imagined. I love you, she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Mason whispered back, his words a promise, a prayer, a benediction. "Always and forever." And in the warm Kansas night, with their family sleeping peacefully around them and their land spreading out beneath the stars, Sarah and Mason held each other close, grateful for every moment that had brought them here, every choice that had led them to each other. Every day they had built together from nothing but hope and determination and love that refused to quit. Their story, which had begun with debt and desperation, had transformed into something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the willingness to take a chance on love, even when it seemed impossible. The cowboy had saved the woman, yes, but she had saved him right back, and together they had created something neither could have built alone, a life rich with meaning, purpose, and the kind of love that lasts forever.